For our first panel on sexuality education, I'm going to call up Callie Wright to introduce and host the panel. So the awesome and amazing Callie Wright.
Good morning, friends. I am in fact Callie, and I host a podcast called Queersplaining. That's not why we're here. We are here for a sex and sexuality panel. So before we get started, I'm just gonna have our panelists introduce themselves. And you'll notice that there are note cards with pens. We definitely do wanna get to audience questions, but for the sake of moving the discussion along, if you can write your questions down and just kind of raise your hand, someone will grab them from you and bring them up. And we'll get to what we can throughout the course of that. So that's how the Q&A will work. So let's have our panelists introduce themselves.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Mark. I'm an associate professor at University of Kentucky. I'm a sex and relationships researcher, educator, and therapist. So I'm certified through ASECT, the American Association for Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. As a sex educator, I teach the sex ed courses at UK, and I also am the director of the Sexual Health Promotion Lab. So we do a lot of research in the area of satisfaction in relationships, integrating pleasure into sex education, how to maintain desire, those types of things. Thanks.
Hi y'all, my name is Jennifer Clay. I am Community Outreach Coordinator with Planned Parenthood of Indiana and Kentucky. In my role with Planned Parenthood, I do a lot of outreach, so talking to folks about the vital and sometimes life-saving services that you can get at our clinics. Additionally, I do work to empower our supporters, volunteers, patient base to advocate for themselves and their bodily autonomy and rights. So that can look like, for example, meeting with a patient and talking to them about their experience and helping them craft a story that they can take to the legislature to testify in front of committees and try to stop bad bills that harm them from being passed. In addition to that work, I've been really thankful to do some really awesome coalition work and coalition building, in part with Dr. Kristen Mark here and with Chris Hartman from Fairness, around kind of the sex ed piece and working to try to get comprehensive, fact-based, and inclusive sex education in public schools, in particular in Fayette County. So I'm super excited to be here today.
Hi all, I'm Chris Hartman. My gender pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm Executive Director of the Fairness Campaign. We're the statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. I've been doing it for a decade now, carting my butt all across the Commonwealth and working to pass anti-discrimination laws, chiefly, that protect LGBTQ plus folks from discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations. And we just got city number 13 right next to us, Georgetown. Hey! Yeah, Georgetown's a good victory. And then also I work in the state legislature as the lobbyist for the Fairness Campaign to also attempt to prevent all sorts of draconian measures that would roll back LGBTQ protections or prohibit LGBTQ folks from living their full and authentic lives. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Cool. So I'd like to kind of jump off the discussion, if we could, just talk about if you could identify your number one challenge in the work that you do and what you're trying to do to overcome that challenge. Whoever wants to take it first. And I'm going to run and grab water while they're talking.
So I would say the number one challenge in the work that we do is trying to kind of recontextualize what a win looks like in a state that is really, really hostile to reproductive rights. So a lot of times, and
I've
Dr. Mark
experienced this.
can testify to this, a lot of times we will go to Frankfurt and we will have some incredible patient stories. We will have providers, we will have some wonderful advocates and supporters who come in and who share their stories and who share the facts. So much so that, there are legislators who are typically absolutely against us. So you can tell are moved. I mean, there's no way not to be moved by the power of some of these folks' stories. But at the end of the day, for some of these legislators, political power is more meaningful to them than the lived experiences of these constituents. And so whenever that bad yes vote or that bad no vote happens, it is absolutely devastating for us and our supporters. So really just finding a way to give folks tools to cope with that when it doesn't work out. Obviously working to build political power so that we can get legislators who will listen to the lived experience of constituents, and really just being able to get back on that horse and keep fighting for those wins, or maybe even reorient ourselves to work towards a new version of a win.
My biggest challenge is that folks just, by and large, don't have a clue about queer identities or queer folks. Or if they do, they don't feel oftentimes that they have the terminology to use to talk about queer people. And so it makes them hesitant to actually have an open, honest, and comfortable conversation about queer people, issues facing the queer community, or queer identities. As I was sharing with my co-panelists here before we started, one of the things that my job has become, and it certainly wasn't this way when I got hired, it just developed organically, that I go out and a good portion of my week is spent doing Queer 101 trainings for everyone and their grandmother. I've trained the entire Louisville Metro Police Department. Right now we're in the midst of doing every Metropolitan Sewer District employee in Louisville. We've done Humana, Brown Foreman. We've done the Administrative Office of the Courts. All the family court judges came and had an open and frank conversation about what does it mean to be genderqueer? What does gender non-binary mean? If somebody is transgender, what does that actually mean? Do you have to have surgery to be transgender? Like, all of these questions, many folks have, but they're not willing to ask it because they don't feel, especially in the workplace, like it's a safe space to have that type of a conversation. And so if we could just incorporate general Queer 101 knowledge into comprehensive sex education, it would go a huge, long way to helping queer folks live in communities where they don't feel like pariahs because people don't have the language to talk about who they are. And something interesting, very swiftly, we did polling about 10 years ago on LGBTQ issues all across the Commonwealth, and we found out something very interesting. First, the vast majority of Kentuckians support LGBTQ non-discrimination, support queer folks, but what we also found out is that the vast majority of Kentuckians did not believe that their friends, family, and neighbors were as accepting as they were. We learned that they were not having conversations with people around them, again, because they weren't comfortable or because they feared ostracization by those around them. And so just having the conversation is the base level beginning for queer folks in Kentucky and elsewhere feeling that full acceptance.
See the light. Okay, so I'm a really pragmatic person, and it's very difficult for me in my position as a sex researcher in Kentucky. I'm also Canadian, so in coming from Canada to Kentucky, as a sex researcher, yeah, it was a tough transition, and I think a lot of the difficulty for me comes from either teaching students who have been taught certain things from their very conservative or very religious families and have just sort of taken those as fact, and those things that really push against each other. So for instance, we talk a lot about how the same people who are anti-choice are also the same people who don't want people to have access to contraception. We can lower the abortion rate if we could have people have full access to contraception. It's a very logical solution. And so that's really probably one of my biggest struggles, is battling with just the opposite of how I see things on a daily basis. And also even with colleagues, you know, I'm in the College of Education, and there's a lot of people who have been there for a really long time and are really sort of set in how our education system works. And then I came in from Canada and just wanted to change things. And I think that the pushback on that has been difficult. I've been here 7 years though, and I will say that about 2 years in, when I was thinking, why am I in Kentucky? I love Lexington now, by the way, but I was like, why am I here? I talked to one of my colleagues in Canada who I really admire, and he said, you know, you have my dream job. And I was like, what? What do you mean? I just took the first tenure track job that came my way. And he said, no, you like are in a place where you can really make a difference and they need you there. And so that really shifted my perspective of why I'm in Kentucky and being really dedicated to being in Kentucky. And so that's sort of what I think back to when I face these challenges. Another thing that I try and do is meet people sort of at their level when faced with those challenges, to somehow allow them to see my logic in a way that isn't sort of emotionally driven, but rather is very like pragmatically driven. So that's the main thing I can think of that's relevant here.
So a theme that I'm kind of hearing as everyone's talking about the challenges that they face, that I think kind of was skirted around in the discussion, but so much of what it comes down to is stigma, right? The fact, like, so many people don't have good comprehensive sex education because there's such a stigma around the word sex, the word orgasm, the proper terminology for genitalia, that kind of stuff. And it's something like every probably 4 or 5 months, there's like a post that goes viral about teaching kids the right words for their body parts, right? Like completely removed from the context of sexuality, just literally like, this is your penis, this is your vagina. And all of the myriad ways that makes things harder for all of us. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the role of stigma in the work that you do and like successes that you've had in overcoming that.
So I was going to start with a failure. So you ending with successes makes it shifts what I'm thinking here.
Because
but
there are great lessons in failure as well.
Yeah. So Jenny and I actually we attended school board meetings for a long time, quite a few months in a row, in order to try and get comprehensive sex education passed. And just using anatomically correct terminology for the adults who are on the panel, that was turned out to be problematic. So we stopped going to those school board meetings. And that was a failure. But it actually ended up not being a failure because we ended up connecting through those meetings with the wellness coordinator, who really connected, who saw that treatment was unjust and saw that this was an important issue. And she worked with us in order to have sort of like a bottom-up approach, and we now have the curriculum approved in all schools that does have comprehensive sex education in high schools. Is it in middle schools too?
Some middle schools.
Some middle schools have it too. But the problem that we're facing now is that teachers don't feel comfortable teaching it, or they're afraid that they're going to lose their job, or they're concerned that parents are going to complain that they're teaching this information to kids. So what we've done to overcome some of that is shifting the language. Like, I want kids to have comprehensive sex education from preschool onward. I just think that that's really important. So don't call it sex education, call it something else. If people are afraid of the word sex, then let's start shifting the narrative on that. So we're about to apply for a grant for some bullying funding related to that will integrate a lot of sex education. But let's not call it that. And so I think that that's one of the ways that we're making some movement in accessing these people who like really need our help in order to access the funds for it. Funding is definitely one of the biggest barriers. It's not a barrier that I mentioned in that last question, but there's not research funding for the work that we do. And so trying to find creative ways to rephrase sort of what we're doing to make it more appealing to funders is a big part of me trying to find funding for my work.
And as we're passing the mic, I will remind, if you have questions, you can write them down, kind of raise your hand, and somebody will grab them from you and bring them to me, and we'll work those into the discussion. So if there's someone who could keep an eye out for those hands up and grab those cards from those folks.
Yeah, and so I would just really echo what Kristen said about taking that approach and trying to reframe the conversation so that folks can be more open-minded when it comes to the notion of teaching comprehensive sex education in schools. So as far as the sex ed piece, I would absolutely echo that. But definitely, the elephant in the room whenever you use the word stigma and you talk about Planned Parenthood is, the real stigma on abortion. And so what we know is that 1 in 4 folks who can get pregnant will have an abortion. And despite that statistical reality, folks just aren't always comfortable having those conversations and talking about abortion for what it is, which is a safe, legal healthcare procedure that can, be a really important and even life-saving thing for a lot of people. So definitely in a lot of our work, it's sharing the stories of real folks who need access to these services and who need access to abortion. And you'll notice I will use that word a lot because that is part of erasing the stigma, is using the language, using the word. And so lifting up those stories so that people realize everyone loves someone who has had an abortion. And actually, that's not my quote. Marcy Krim from Kentucky Health Justice Network, a Practical Abortion Fund, is the person who I heard say that. So I got to give Marcy credit, even though she's not here. But yeah, so just lifting up those stories and not giving it that power, right? So really fighting through that stigma, despite some folks' discomfort.
Yeah, the stigma around the word sex is so real. Do you know when we were losing around marriage equality, it was when we were calling it same-sex marriage. Because all that our opponents were hearing was the word sex, that it wasn't about the love that we had for each other, it wasn't about our families, our children, it was just about the sex act that they did not want to envision, didn't want to imagine, couldn't wrap their minds around how anybody could do that type of thing. And then, and I know that we're going to honor some of the folks that helped made marriage equality possible later today. It was really Evan Wolfson with the national movement Freedom to Marry who helped reframe the conversation around LGBTQ marriage to the freedom to marry. Or, I stopped using same-sex marriage in all of my press materials and started using same-gender marriage. And just eliminating the word sex completely shifted that conversation. And what we found, and this is about meeting people where they are, right? This is about how we win in a smart way. What we have found on non-discrimination laws and every other LGBTQ right is that if we talk about our shared values with everyone else, if we talk about the desire to earn a living, to put a roof over our heads, to earn your paycheck after a hard day's work, and specifically on marriage, when we talk about the love and the commitment that we share and the fact that we've made a covenant with one another to be with each other for life, to be life partners, that is exactly when the dialogue around marriage equality shifted, and when it was possible for us to have that huge upsurge of support. As a gay teen, I never thought that I would have the legal right to marry. Now I don't know that I want it, but we've got it now, and it was because we listened to folks. If you're not familiar, you're probably not, with the Movement Advancement Project, more commonly called MAP. It's a national LGBTQ messaging organization, and they do this hard work. They sit folks down in focus groups, and they literally find out what are the words that turn people off, that ignite what we call the lizard brain. That lizard brain, that and suddenly you can't hear anything else. I use LGBTQ or LGBT all the time, but for folks who aren't part of our community or who sort of aren't woke, those letters just fly right past them. And the language that they hear which is not as inclusive, which is why I don't like using it, but the term gay and transgender is what people who are in the movable middle, because we're never going to move some people, but the folks in the movable middle who aren't certain where they are on these issues, there are a few key words that if we just shift the language a little bit, they become a lot more palatable, the ideas become palatable, and that's when we'll ultimately see full acceptance.
So, great question from the audience. I am the teacher sponsor for the Gender and Sexuality Alliance at a Louisville high school. What should I and what legally can I bring up with my students?
Everything!
I imagine what
You can't bring sadly. You should check with the administration of the school, because in Kentucky there's site-based decision-making councils that determine what can be talked about at each individual school. So there are, I teach our undergrad sex ed class that at UK that trains students to be teachers, and I tell them, I'm teaching you all of this stuff. You're going to need to check with your administrators at your school and make sure that you're not going to get fired for saying any of this stuff. So I make that very clear to them, because it is a very real possibility that they could get into a lot of trouble for saying certain things in the state. So making sure that you're checking with the principal, checking with the administration, making sure that they have your back. And I don't know what the rules of that particular school are, because even in Lexington, they're so varied.
And so it's an individual thing. It's not just like, well, here's the law in Kentucky. You can't it's not that simple. Other thoughts?
Oh, I was just going to say, there are pretty much no statewide legal guidelines in terms of sex ed. There isn't even a bill in the books that says that sex ed has to be fact-based.
It doesn't have to be medically accurate either.
It doesn't have to be fact-based, doesn't have to be medically accurate. Whenever we have had discussions about sex ed with legislators in Frankfurt, they've often told us, this isn't the state's prerogative, but of course what we tell them is, it should be your prerogative. It should be your prerogative to make sure that all schools are teaching comprehensive, fact-based information, because it's what's best for our youth. So just flagging that there are no bills that mandate that sex ed be taught and that it be accurate.
Glad I'm not a teacher. I would have already been fired.
Well, and so specifically the questioner brought up high school, and so obviously there's no like one single answer to what's legal. In general, could you talk about what you feel is appropriate? Just in like if anything is legal, yeah, developmentally appropriate. Like what level of conversation are you having with folks who are that age?
High schoolers, I would say go for it, like whatever. Grade 9 forward, they can handle the information. Many of them are already having sex. The average age of first menstruation is 10 now. The average age of first sex is 17. So that's actually remained like pretty stable, but menstruation has gotten younger. And they need to know this information. They're learning it either from their peers or they're learning it from online. So in terms of LGBTQ related stuff, they should be learning that stuff in middle school related to identity development. So I would say developmentally appropriate is by grade 9, you can really be talking about just about everything that they want to know, you know.
Right. Hello, kids. Let's talk about penises. Obviously, if they're asking the question, yeah, that makes sense.
I don't have much to share, but I just want to say that it's so important that when sex education is being taught, that queer sex and the mechanics around queer sex are being taught as well. You know, not everybody's body is the same, as we well know. People are born with all sorts of different parts and different makeups, and so addressing that openly from the beginning, everybody is aware of the trans panic defense that people still use in court today. I found out they were trans, and my lizard brain ignited, and I just had to murder them. And it's been banned in some states, but definitely not here. I sat in a courtroom for 2 weeks and I watched trans panic play out. If we're having the conversation about how everybody's body is unique and about the different ways that sex can work and sexual pleasure and romantic intimacy as early as possible, that is what is going to eliminate the disproportionate physical and sexual assault, particularly against transgender women in our community.
I have one quick thing to add. I just have a quick thing to add to that.
Yeah.
One way to also be very inclusive is to talk about, and I think that teenagers in particular need this, to talk about the fact that sex is a broad term. Like, sex doesn't mean just penile vaginal intercourse. Like, sex is defined broadly. And teenagers don't get that, right? Like, losing your virginity is still certainly a thing, and that means one very specific thing. And so, reframing that for them and letting them know that sex is actually really broad. There's a lot of different activities that count as sex. You get to define what sex is to you, and that's important for you to claim. So
we've got like 4 minutes left, and this question is really a great one to mostly end the panel on. There's another question that is kind of trans-related that I feel comfortable answering. There is a video of a coach or health teacher showing how to properly put on a condom, but he had to use a sock. This went viral. Is this the future for sex ed? And so, like, reactions to that concept, but also thoughts in general on what the future looks like, and if you could give like a takeaway, like maybe 1 or 2 things the folks in the room could do to help.
I show that video to my sex ed students every semester. I love that video. And I try and tell them to get creative for those things. So, what was it? Take home message?
Yeah, so just some kind of
where
take-home
it's
message,
headed.
like,
So I think, people get really concerned about having to, about the internet and the fact that kids are exposed to porn. So porn literacy is part of the future, making sure that kids know about porn literacy and are porn literate. Also, consent education, shockingly, is only just now becoming relevant, which is insane, but it should have been. That's the types of things that we need to learn in preschool sex ed, is like good touch, bad touch, how to say no, your body is yours, those types of things. So we have a lot of catching up to do with kids now. And so I think those 2 topics are really important. And also, if schools aren't going to be willing to integrate sex ed, then I think there's going to be a place for other ways to deliver this information. There's some great YouTubers out there doing that, and I think we're going to continue to see that, and maybe some of it will be more like standardized across.
So that video is kind of great, right? It really shows that there are teachers out there who care deeply and who, despite perhaps some professional pressures not to teach that material, they are finding workarounds in the system. They're finding ways to have those conversations and give those lessons anyway. Obviously, we'd like to get to a place where the really cool gym teacher could just use a condom, right? So absolutely, I love the creativity there, but definitely we're hoping for a future where it's just not stigmatized, it's normalized. To have these conversations in the classroom, but then also it's so important that parents, right, or that guardians at home are having these conversations with kids as well. So definitely hoping to just, and part of my role with Planned Parenthood by lifting up stories and things like that, it's just really the belief that if we can facilitate and open up these conversations, we can all live happier, healthier, more empowered lives. And of course, we want that for our kids.
So we got 1 minute if we could.
Yes, quickly. For me, the future is absent of new HIV infections. There is Zero reason, there's zero reasons now to become HIV infected. You all are probably aware that PrEP is on the rise. You can get a PrEP prescription from Planned Parenthood these days. You can take one pill every day of your lives, and no matter your exposure to HIV, you will not seroconvert. There is the morning after pill for HIV now, which is the exact same medication. If you take it within 72 hours after being exposed to HIV, you will not seroconvert. There is no reason that we should not be teaching comprehensive HIV education in schools these days. I don't know about you all, but when I went to my Catholic high school, all boys high school, our HIV education was watching the film Philadelphia, which was just mind-blowing to me. It made me gayer, by the way, but like in terms of education, it was just awful. So, you know, we've got a lot of great work to do. You all are the ones out there helping us do it, and thank you all so much.
And so one quick, very quick thing, because this is actually a really important question about pronouns, whether it's like acceptable to ask people for their pronouns. In the time that we have, what I will say is I would love to normalize the idea of introducing yourself with your pronouns, which I realize I actually forgot to do at the top of this talk, and that's my bad. That's the quick answer. There's like a lot more to say about it, and whoever asked that question, please, like when I'm not on stage, feel free to come ask me and talk to me about it, because I have kind of a treatise on that. And if there are other people that are curious, after the panels, I don't have any like super firm commitments, so I'm happy to have that conversation with the depth that it needs to have when there's more time. So thank you.